And we're going to talk about how we fix the problem of what's going on in Gaza at the moment. And Mr. Trump has presented his 20-point plan this week. And we're not going to talk about the plan in huge depth because that's been covered much elsewhere. There's certainly a 2,500 word bit on it on my Substack. But we are going to talk about one specific aspect that you flagged up this morning, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth looking. I mean, look, the plan had a deadline of 72 hours, didn't it? So now we're down to 40, not quite 48 hours, but the clock is ticking on Hamas to acknowledge this and make a response to it. And I have to say that my first thoughts about this plan were about the contrast between this blueprint and the European effort. I mean, for a start, it seemed as if Trump was able to get the entire Middle Eastern world on board with his plan without telling the Europeans, because if the Europeans would have known about it, presumably they wouldn't have launched their own version. So that just alone seemed to make the Europeans so profoundly impotent. But the difference between lining them up, one plan against the other, it was very clear that, the Trump plan, for all Trump's faults, it wants Israel to win. And the European plan doesn't necessarily want Hamas to win, but it wants Israel to lose. It wants to, the hostages were the first fundamental condition of the Trump plan. Release the hostages, then we can talk. But in the European plan, the hostages were only mentioned as wishful thinking, or recognize a Palestinian state. We want the hostages back, please.
Well, that was my conclusion when I was writing about it. Is that actually the plan I think is flawed. There's not enough detail to go into huge depth on it yet, but there are some flaws in there. But if it gets the hostages home, that's the best possible outcome at this point.
Exactly.
The fact that Trump has led with that shows that his priorities are in the right place. But also, it's indicative of a wider attitude in Europe that we've forgotten how to win.
Yes.
Because we've had 20 years of wars, which we kind of, weren't really wars. They were peacekeeping, nation building, counterinsurgency, whatever you want to call them. But they sort of stumbled towards their conclusions and just dripped out with no kind of firm conclusion. Northern Ireland's the one that gets thrown around all the time. And, that was, again, a very, very different situation that doesn't bear comparison to Gaza. But if we have Ukraine as our example, look, we've given them enough weapons for the last 3 years to keep them in the fight and keep them bleeding and keep them bleeding Russia. But what we haven't done is given them enough equipment to decisively finish this damn thing.
Yeah.
And that seems to be kind of our default setting when it comes to war, is that war should just stop immediately and that should be the end of it. And it should come to a negotiation and a ceasefire. When actually, most wars in history, certainly prior to 1945, are the ones that you have to win.
Exactly.
Because you're trying to use war as it's armed force to enact government political goals, and you're compelling your enemy to do your will. And I saw Rob Lyman join this, and he'll know exactly which author I'm quoting when I say that. But we've kind of forgotten that that's the whole purpose of armed conflict, is to compel your enemy to do something else. And I saw someone on Twitter say, so what they're effectively saying to Hamas is surrender or die. It's like, yes, that's exactly what they're saying.
What's the problem with that?
What happens when you lose wars? It's
exactly,
it's a very, very strange framing.
And it's interesting that not only have we forgotten that war is about winning, but we've been trying to impose that on Israel for some time. Whenever Israel goes to war, it gets to a point where it's just beginning to win, and then it suddenly everyone says, no, down your weapons, enough is enough, pull back, don't win. And it does feel, this sort of keys into a broader point, I think, which is that we're just trying to, while it feels to me like as we're committing slow suicide by forgetting who we are, swamping ourselves with immigration, driving our economy into the ground, neglecting our defense and so on, we're committing slow suicide. We're trying to demand that the Israelis commit fast suicide, but it's the same sort of suicide, and for them it's in war. But the Trump plan, the other amazing thing about the Trump plan, it prioritized Israeli security alongside the hostages, the release of the hostages, and the surrender of Hamas, uncompromising. This is what we demand as a first port of call. But also it had the entire Arab world behind it, including notably Qatar and Turkey, the two main sponsors of Hamas, are backing this plan, which is fascinating, which means that it's left Hamas boxed in. And the European plan left Israel boxed in. And that is the difference here. The boxing in of Hamas is major, because if Hamas is to reject this deal, then certainly in Bibi's eyes, and I think in the eyes of a lot of observers, that will give Israel effective backing from the Arab world to destroy Hamas, to finish the job, as he puts it. That's arguable, but it could be perceived in that way. Certainly, Qatar will be under pressure to expel Hamas from Qatar after being attacked by Israel. It will be under pressure to do that if Hamas rejects the deal that Qatar has supported, and the same with Turkey. So Hamas is politically and diplomatically boxed in, which is what everyone's been criticizing Trump for not being a great diplomat. Well, this would suggest otherwise, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the flanker here is the irrationality of Hamas. I think that's the real thing here, is that, they do have, I suppose, moderates, you could call them. Moderate, if we shift that Overton window way over there, they're on the less extremism. But then you've got people like Ghazi Hamad, who are absolute hardliners, and would happily die or see people in Gaza die. I mean, he's not going to die in his 7-star Doha hotel room, but he's quite happy to keep that sacrifice going, and sending his troops to heaven, so that Israel can continue to be degraded on the international stage. So it's whether the rational heads in those Hamas leadership in Doha prevail, or whether it's the Hamads who prevail, and then just keep this war going, and keep the suffering and the misery going for everyone concerned.
But it seems difficult to see how. I mean, look, Hamas, fanatical, as you say, irrational. No one knows how they'll behave, but it's difficult to see how they will be able to resist when the entire Arab world is calling upon them to do so, to accept the deal. It's so much pressure.
There's a trap here. There's a trap here that they can set for Israel, I think, and that is if they keep doing what they're doing. I don't know if you saw Ahmad Al-Khatib's post the other day, and I would urge you to review the Gaza City Substack piece I wrote a couple of weeks ago, because the predictions in that, humbly, I smashed that out the park. I pretty much called it.
I wouldn't have thought anything less, Andrew.
And one of the things that I did predict was that Hamas would melt away. And now Ahmad's spoken to people on the ground that have confirmed Hamas have given an order to do that. And what they can trap Israel into is chasing them around the Gaza Strip. They're happy to die. They've got a good number of fighters, probably more than 10,000 still. I mean, the majority of those will be goons, untrained goons, mostly underage, actually. So if they get killed, great, because that adds to the children killed by Israel list. That they don't have to be particularly well trained. They just need to have a rifle and be able to enforce whatever Hamas want them to do. But if Israel ends up in this sort of fruitless whack-a-mole around Gaza, you're going to continue to see that degradation on the international scale. In my article, I predicted that more moves would be taken against Israel diplomatically, and of course, we saw that slew of recognitions of Palestine. And that opens, of course, the door to more sanctions. UEFA, for example, have paused their negotiations to kick Maccabi Tel Aviv out of the European football competition. And all that stuff will go switched back on, I suspect, if this deal gets turned down, even if it's Hamas doing the turning down, because what these people want is to make Israel quit.
Sure, I mean,
that's what
I get all that, but
for.
I suppose the question is, though, how, like, you wrote that before we had this plan, obviously, and the question is, how much of a game changer will Qatar, Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, and so on backing this plan? How much of a game changer will that prove to be? And only time will tell. But it's quite possible that the pressure, particularly from Qatar, on Hamas to give up now, to give up the hostages, to accept amnesty, and to surrender, that pressure might be the game changer here that does secure the end to this.
I mean, as always, you're the optimist, and I'm the cynical pessimist on this one.
Yeah.
But I'm skeptical of the extent to which Qatar or Turkey have actually turned on Hamas. I suspect they're playing nice with Trump rather than turning against Hamas. So they can certainly pay lip service to, we told them, we support this. But they're Muslim Brotherhood countries, and we have to remember how the Muslim Brotherhood operate.
Yeah.
Because they think in decades, they think in long-term planning, and they think in terms of infiltration rather than direct action. And so it's a bottom-up kind of theory. And if I'm Qatar or Turkey looking at this Trump plan, I'm thinking, okay, we can infiltrate this new system. Yes, there'll be an interim government, but there has to be a Palestinian Arab government of Gaza at some point, and we can infiltrate that all day long. And it's what the Sadrists did in Iraq in 2005. So when we went into Iraq as the British Army in Basra, we took over the city with actually, some rounds fired, but it wasn't a kinetic urban battle. It was a fairly short, sharp operation that made the Iraqi army put their weapons down and flee. And the British were initially praised for how peaceful Basra was. People forget it didn't emerge into an insurgency until sort of 2004-05. We were running around in soft Land Rovers with berets on rather than helmets, congratulating ourselves that we knew all about how to do this because of Belfast. And there's a great book called, a great article, I think it was Frank Ledwidge, like Basra's not Belfast. It really rips that argument apart. But the Sadrists played nice with the British when they were setting up the interim authority in Basra and moving towards elections. They were their best friends, and they ran for election. It was the Fadila Party and one other ran as Islamic Basra, I think was the slate they ran on. They won like 60% of the seats. And then the minute the election was over, the whole place just descended into violence because it was actually Fadila and their friends' militias that were causing the violence. And the violence was directed against the British Army because they were the only thing standing between these people and total hegemony within the Basra area. So it's a very clever way to do it. You play nice, infiltrate, win democratic legitimacy through elections, and then your militias can then complete the takeover and it affects the violence. So if I'm Qatar and Turkey now, I'm looking at that and I think that's probably the model I'm adopting. I think get an end to the war and then just start rebuilding, but do it really in the Muslim Brotherhood way, which is that bottom-up, slow infestation of all the institutions, and then you gradually take over politically, and then you get to rock and roll.
I mean, that's really interesting.
Coming through.
No, I mean that's fascinating. I mean that does sort of accept that the war comes to an end, that Hamas accepts the deal, but then tries to infiltrate thereafter, which would mean the end of the war, would mean the release of the hostages, which would be fantastic. I mean, let's just not downplay that. That would be amazing. Because then what you're pointing out, you're nudging the discussion towards is the difficulties in the implementation of the day after plan. For years, people have complained about the lack of a day after plan. Now we've got a serious day after plan, but it's not going to be easy at all. And what you've described is one of the major potential pitfalls of a potential quagmire for this day after plan. There are so many others. We're talking about international security force made up of, we're not sure which countries, probably Arab forces, but which ones we don't know. Are they going to really risk their lives in the same way that the IDF did to combat Hamas in a counterinsurgency operation? If they're unable to, if Hamas launches a rocket or an attack on Israel, will the IDF be able to go in and do the business? Will there be that level of deconfliction and cooperation? And then how will de-radicalization take place? Who will administer it? The civil society, who will administer that? Who's going to pay for it? And what will the relationship be between Trump and Blair and the Palestinians supposed to be administering this plan? And who will these Palestinians be? They're supposed to be technocratic and not politically aligned. Well, I think not politically aligned is a difficult thing to find in the Palestinian territory, for one thing, and technocratic just means corrupt. When you say that, it translates into Arabic as corrupt. So I'm not sure. So and that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's so many other problems as well in the longer term. So like you say, it's a framework, it's an ambitious roadmap, to use that term, for a resolution. But all of those details are problematic, difficult, and again, could be subject to Muslim Brotherhood infiltration. But the main thing is that the war would come to an end and the hostages would be freed, which is the immediate term goal, isn't it? Yeah, exactly that. And that's why I think it's so important that there's a really tight timeline on that hostage release, like immediately, effectively. I think it was in 48, 72 hours. It was really, 72 really swift. 72 it was, yeah. So now we're down
a
bit.
Swift release, and then we can deal with it. And there was an interesting one on the de-radicalisation that popped into my head when you were talking, and that's...
You've been listening to a clip from the Brink's Rapid Response to the News on Substack Live. For further episodes, sign up today at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk.